Thank you very much. It is with a deep sense of obligation and duties to the custodians, to the owners of this land on which we're meeting, the Ngunnawal people, that I pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and in particular, and not just because last week we marked International Women's Day, I would like to mention the leading role of women, the women of the First Nations, as custodians of sophisticated and complex knowledge, as community organizers, and I think very importantly, as beacons of wisdom, especially for those of us who suffer from a masculine condition. Ladies and gentlemen, today I'm looking forward to discussing with you several thoughts, ideas and concerns with a view to reclaiming on behalf of Europe and Australia a shared future in a world which is changing, a world in which both Europe and Australia are becoming increasingly irrelevant. And to do so, I must add that, not merely as a European or Greek politician, but also a proud citizen of Australia. Europe and Australia are facing a common predicament, an existential threat, a creeping irrelevance which is due to two reasons. Firstly, we have invested far too little for far too long. And secondly, we have allowed ourselves to go along an ill-considered slide from strategic dependence on the United States to a non-strategic, self-defeating servility to Washington's agenda. Our present moment in Europe and Australia has been shaped by three different important post-war phases. The first phase was the Bretton Woods system, from 1944 to 1971. America exited the Second World War as the only creditor country, the only surplus country. Bretton Woods was a remarkable recycling mechanism, and in effect a dollar zone that was founded on fixed exchange rates, sustained by capital controls, and directed on the back of America's gigantic, at the time, trade surplus. With quasi-free trade being part of the deal, Washington dollarized Europe, Japan, and Australia as part of a deal, the purpose of which was to create aggregate demand for all those products coming out of the production lines of the manufacturing sector of the United States, which had become so remarkably productive and efficient during the war economy. Subsequently, the United States trade surplus operated like a vacuum cleaner, hoovering out of our countries the dollars they had sent us through their net exports. The result was 20 years of high growth, low unemployment, low inflation, beautifully boring banking, dwindling inequality. But, alas, that golden era of capitalism, the Bretton Woods system, was dead in the water the moment the United States slipped from being a surplus country to a country with a very large trade deficit. The second phase was marked by the violent reversal of this recycling mechanism. The United States became the first hegemon in the history of humanity that increased its hegemony by boosting its trade deficit, by going further into the red. Operating like another powerful vacuum cleaner, the burgeoning American trade deficit hoovered up the world's net exports. And how did America pay for these imports? With dollars, which it also hoovered up from the rest of the world, as German, Japanese, and later Chinese capitalists sent to Wall Street more than 70% of their profits for recycling in Wall Street in the form of treasuries, government debt, real estate, shares, and of course, later on, the infamous derivatives. This audacious inverted recycling system, founded on America's deficits, required ever-increasing American deficits in order to remain stable. In the process, it gave rise to growth rates even faster than those under the Bretton Woods system. However, it also gave rise to gigantic macroeconomic and financial imbalances, as well as mind-numbing levels of inequality. The new era came complete with an ideology, remember neoliberalism, with a policy of letting finance rip, financialization, and a false sense of dynamic equilibrium. Remember the Great Moderation, which was built, of course, on hugely immoderate imbalances. Almost inevitably, on the back of this perpetual tsunami of capital, rushing in from the rest of the world to Wall Street, financiers fashioned gargantuan pyramids of complex derivatives, what Warren Buffett referred to as weapons of mass financial destruction. They went off, and we had the GFC, the global financial crisis. Capitalism and Wall Street were saved by the G7 central banks that printed between April 2009 and last year. They printed all the G7 central banks together around 35 trillion American dollars. That was one reason capitalism was saved. The second was China. China directed half its national income to investment, and in so doing replaced a lot of the lost aggregate demand, not just domestically in China, but also in the United States, in Germany, and Australia. The third period, the third phase, is more recent. I call it the era of techno-feudalism, and that's the book that you kindly mentioned. I believe that this third era took root in the mid-2000s, but grew strongly after the GFC in conjunction with a rapid technological change that caused capital to mutate into a new form. I call it cloud capital. It's what lives inside your phone, inside your laptop. It's an automated means of behavioral modification. Consider the 6 things that cloud capital does. Where do you encounter it? When you go into Amazon.com, when you go into Uber. The 6 things that cloud capital does: it grabs our attention. First, it manufactures our desires. Third, it sells directly to us the things that will satiate the desires that it has manufactured. Fourth, it drives and monitors workers in the workplace, whether the workplace is a factory, an Amazon warehouse, or the cab of a truck in which a driver, monitored by the same algorithm, works. Fifth, it elicits massive free labor from all of us every time we click, we like, or we post whatever we do on the internet. And finally, it provides the potential for blending seamlessly all that with digital payments. Is it any wonder that the owners of this cloud capital, I call them cloudalists, is it any wonder that these cloudalists have hitherto undreamt of power? They are already a new ruling class. If you look at the capitalization of the 7 cloudalist firms in the United States, also known as the Magnificent Seven, you'll find that their capitalization of those 7 firms is larger than the capitalization of every listed company in the following countries: United Kingdom, France, Japan, Canada, and China taken together. Where did the money come for so much cloud capital to accumulate? Where did all this investment come from? Remember the $35 trillion that the G7 central banks produced after the GFC? That's where the money came. One example. 9 out of $10 invested by Zuckerberg in Facebook came from central bank money. So the issue, ladies and gentlemen, is not what will AI do to us in the future. The issue is what it has already done to us. And now a question of immense importance to Europe and to Australia. In which countries is cloud capital concentrated? In the United States and in China. Nowhere else. Hold that thought, I'll come back to it. First, let's say a few words about Europe. Most of you will know me as the failed finance minister of the most bankrupt state in Europe. Though I take solace that some people here in Canberra, including one or two government ministers, remember me as their Sydney University economics lecturer. In my defense, and lest we forget, the reason why I was elected to the finance minister in 2015 was because we had a catastrophic, cataclysmic collapse, not just of Greece, but the whole of the Eurozone, the whole of the European Union's banking sector, and then a domino effect, with Greece being simply the canary in the mine. The reason why Europe was so severely damaged by the GFC was the ludicrous monetary architecture that we had erected. We had a monetary union that had a central bank without a treasury to have its back, and we had 19 treasuries without a central bank to have their back, while they were trying to bail out 19 separate banking systems that were all bankrupt. In short, even if European governments wanted, after 2008, to emulate the sensible response to the GFC of the Rudd administration, of the Rudd government, we simply lacked the institutions to do it in Europe. And the result was the European doom loop between banking losses, stagnation, unpayable public and private debts, and an investment strike lasting a quarter of a century. The result of which today is Europe's, and in particular Germany's, deindustrialization. Quarter of a century later, whereas once, 25 years ago, we had a debilitating north-south divide in Europe, now we also have an east-west divide, in addition to the north-south divide. While the essential fiscal and political union that Europe needs is further away from the horizon than ever. The European Union's so-called Green Deal is honored in the breach, not in the implementation. Europe's industries are falling behind their competitors in the United States and China in every technological race that matters, particularly green technology and green energy. And our continent lacks cloud capital in the age of techno-feudalism, where power stems from owning copious amounts of cloud capital. The capital that only the United States and China possess. In my introduction, I said, controversially, I hope, that Europe and Australia are facing irrelevance and marginalization. Two other reasons. One, neither Europe nor Australia possess sufficient quantities of cloud capital. It's a bit like trying to make your way in the 19th century without steam engines and locomotives. And the second reason is the new Cold War, which is upending Europe's and Australia's business model. Speaking of the new Cold War, almost a year ago, in this prestigious institution, Paul Keating lambasted the Albanese government for making the wrong call in allowing Australia to become complicit in Washington's pursuit of that new Cold War, against Australia's interests. The one question that Paul Keating did not ask was, why is Washington doing this? What lies behind the new Cold War? Why did President Trump kickstart this confrontation with the banning of Huawei and ZTE and then the aluminium tariffs? And please don't say that that's what Trump does, because Joe Biden, who was supposed to be the anti-Trump, gets elected, and what does he do? He turbocharges that Cold War by declaring economic warfare against Beijing, because that is what you do when you say you are not going to be allowed to import advanced microchips. When I ask this question in the United States, amongst my friends there, I get two answers as to the rationale behind the new Cold War. One is Taiwan. the escalating military threat to international trade by the Chinese government. Taiwan and escalation. I'm afraid I remain depressingly unconvinced. I wish I could have been convinced. Ever since Nixon went to China, and during the long period when Washington was strong-arming Australia, Europe, to accept China in the World Trade Organization, in the circuits of international capitalism, it was very clear that the one China policy was a given, that Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan was never contested by the West. So what has changed? As for China's military threat, I'm afraid that on this I'm with Malcolm Fraser when he opined once that we will only be able to talk about a provocation of the Chinese military when Chinese Navy ships anchored just outside the San Diego base of the US Navy in the United States or outside Norfolk, Virginia. And please, can someone explain to me the rationale behind the accusation that China is threatening international shipping routes when China is a country that depends entirely on a current account surplus and importing energy? Why would they ever want to jeopardize international shipping routes? No, ladies and gentlemen, the new Cold War is neither due to Taiwan nor to China. The answer lies, and this is my hypothesis, in cloud capital. America's hegemony since 1971 is built on its trade deficit, which is a paradox. And that, however, relies entirely on its capacity to maintain its monopoly over international dollar-denominated payments. That is what allows the United States to make the rest of the world pay for its deficits. But Chinese cloud capital has already achieved something that the dollar system has not achieved and cannot achieve. It has seamlessly integrated cloud capital with financial services. For example, take WeChat, an application that is provided by Chinese conglomerate Tencent. It allows you, or allows anyone who has a one account to make free payments anywhere. Free payments, independently of where they bank. That is not available in Australia, in Europe, in the United States. Similarly, the digital currency of the Central Bank of China. Why is there no American equivalent to this? It's really very simple. Because Wall Street will not allow it. Wall Street refuses to share financial rents either with the West Coast Silicon Valley cloud elites or with the Federal Reserve. And there's the rub. America still maintains its dominance over international payments, payments that are traveling along a rickety dollar highway full of potholes and technological backwardness, which nevertheless remains the highway of choice for global money. Meanwhile, Chinese cloud capital has constructed an all-singing, all-dancing payment superhighway, denominated in one, that very few use. But this superhighway's very existence is a clear and present danger to the American monopoly of the dollar payment system on which America's hegemony rests, especially after the war in Ukraine created jitters amongst oligarchs from Saudi Arabia to Indonesia to the Philippines, and some in Europe as well, who started using that superhighway, fearing that their monies may be confiscated at some point. In short, the new Cold War has nothing to do with trade routes, Taiwan, or Chinese escalation. It is rather the manifestation of a dangerous clash between two techno-feudal systems, one denominated in dollars, the other in Chinese yuan. So, if I'm right, the question becomes, what should Australia do in this topsy-turvy world, which is increasingly techno-feudal? At the domestic front, first, we, and I say we, because I am the proud carrier of an Australian passport, as I said, the first thing we must do is we must ditch the old rentier business model of banking on holes and homes, because this old model of Australia is now a Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme whose maintenance will result in a country marred by minimal investment in the things that matter, low productivity, debilitating inequality, high inflation, and low wages, pushing the talented people of this country, especially the young, into a low innovation sinkhole. Instead, we should adopt in this country a Green New Deal for Australia as a necessity, not as a luxury. Let me give you an example. Europe is about to introduce a border adjustment carbon tax. America surely will follow. So will others. So Australia must end its dependence on dirty fossil fuels and unrefined minerals and let rip on solar power and wind, but primarily solar. To do what with it? To produce green hydrogen. To do what with it? Not to export it, but to use it domestically in a new manufacturing sector, intermediate manufacturing sector, that refines copper, cobalt, nickel into green copper, green cobalt, green steel, and then transport it and export it to Asia, where the batteries will be manufactured, that will go into the electric vehicles that will be sold to Europe and to the rest of the world as green technology. That, I think, is the future for an Australia that participates in the international division of green labour. But for that to happen, this country needs a massive injection of public investment. The private sector will not do it. Nothing short of a latter-day 1950s snowy scheme is necessary here. Second, acknowledge that it has never been more dismal to be young in this country. Reverse the absurdity of the Australian government collecting more money from HECS than it does from the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax. Tax rents properly to make higher education free again. And negative gearing, and in particular, the egregious, inane capital gains exemption over real estate investments. Tax those with concentrated power to set prices, and tax them through the nose. And move away from the mentality of tax cuts as something which is clever and good. It is neither clever nor good. You care about the youth? Build social housing. Because social housing has a twin effect. Firstly, it benefits those who take it. Secondly, by increasing supply, it reduces or caps the inflation in the prices of private homes. So everybody benefits. That's the second thing I would do. The third, since Australian capitals cannot compete with the big tech, the cloudalists of the west coast of the United States or of China, it is the role of the Australian government, in the same way that it once created the ABC or CSIRO, it is the role of the Australian government to put at the disposal of Australians important new technologies, to build up public cloud capital, beginning with a digital Australian dollar that the Reserve Bank of Australia can provide tomorrow. Essentially, a free checking account for every resident of this country based on your tax file number with a PIN number. Receiving on your deposits there the interest rate provided by the Reserve Bank of Australia to those who already have accounts with them, the bankers, at the overnight rate.